Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. Now, this is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Shannon Marcus, Vivian Leigh, Michael Stoker, Joshua Belfer, and Clay Smith. All right, let's get to the second article, titled The Prevalence of Life-Threatening Diagnoses in Emergency Department Patients with Chest Pain in a National Group, out of the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. Okay, so every time you have a medical student, you can kind of run through with them what are the big can't miss causes of chest pain. And these are going to be, well, they came up with sort of 7 typical ones, which are typical things you're going to worry about: ACS, PE, thoracic aortic dissection, pericardial tamponade, pneumothorax, esophageal rupture, and ruptured aortic aneurysm. The question that these authors wanted to answer, though, is how commonly is it actually one of these problems? These are all things that we watch out for, but how often are they there? So this was a large retrospective study of 13.7 million emergency department visits from 141 emergency departments across 17 states from 2021 to 2024. And they looked at just the patients who had chest pain as their presenting complaint, which was 6.9% of all of these patients, so just about a million patients. And then 5.5% of those patients had one of these major chest pain causes. With acute coronary syndromes, ACS, at 0.64% of all visits and 4.5% of those, taking up 4.5 of the 5.5% of chest pain diagnoses. And so most chest pain patients who have a sort of one of these critical diagnoses tend to have ACS, about 80% of them. After that is when you start to get the numbers on the other things. The next most common were pulmonary embolism and then pneumothorax, but these are fractions of 1%, so these are really unlikely to happen. Thoracic aortic dissection, 0.09%. The rest were less than 1 in 10,000 chest pain visits. So it starts to get into numbers that are like, oh, you might never see this. However, there certainly were features that make it much more likely that you have one of these critical diagnoses: older age, male sex, ambulance arrival, high acuity on the triage. Of course, these are things that make patients in general more likely to be sick. But really, being over 75, you had about a 10 times higher chance of having one of these critical diagnoses compared to someone who's 18 to 34. And of course, this makes sense. We expect this. What I would have liked a little bit more resolution on is what exactly counted as ACS. This is everything from angina to a STEMI. Angina being a kind of subjective diagnosis most of the time. So I don't want to get too hung up on these numbers since they didn't subdivide this. I'd like to know how many of these patients actually had MIs, and some of them were having some chest pain and they look like cardiac patients. And so you go, oh, you're probably having angina. Something that was also of note was that only about 36% of patients that actually had one of these major diagnoses actually presented with chest pain as their presenting complaint. Mind you, this is all retrospective data. All of it is taken from coding and things like that. So a lot of this can be very unreliable data, but still, all the same, a lot of patients are not going to present with chest pain just because they have one of these classic diagnoses, or at least that's not what they tell the person at the front. I think these are good numbers to know. This kind of gives a little bit of information to your pre-test probability for these patients. That is that if you haven't asked your patient any history questions yet, what are the odds that they actually have one of these critical diagnoses? And then you can kind of ramp up that pretest probability depending on what they actually say. Esophageal rupture is extremely rare unless you're interviewing, someone who swallows swords for a living. In a spoonful, that is how often the scary diagnoses of chest pain actually occur, which is not that frequently. Then the third article, titled Rethinking Trauma Transport, Mortality and Lengths of Stay in the Non-EMS Transported Patients, out of the journal Injury. Now, I'm going to say it was about a year ago, we covered a very similar article, which looked at the modes of transportation of patients to the hospital. And there's some pros and cons for all of them. Now, ideally, yeah, I guess we would all want to get to the hospital in an ambulance because then you've got paramedics who are right there, who are going to help you out. They might even be able to give you some pain control depending on how advanced they are as paramedics, or they can actually treat what your problem is. Now, it used to be that we didn't get people to the hospital right away when they had trauma. We sort of stayed and played a little bit. Now we know that these patients just really need to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. They need blood and a surgeon. And so that has improved mortality. With that in mind, might it be better if we just chose whatever method got our patients to the hospital the quickest, even if it's not an ambulance? What if it's the police officers who might respond sooner? Or what if it's just a private vehicle? So any of the bystanders who happen to be there, should they throw this bleeding, traumatized patient in the back of their car and just drive them to the hospital? I mean, there's actually a pretty good argument for it. The article that we covered a while ago seemed to say that. It seems that patients which were transported by private vehicle were benefiting from this. Is that going to hold up in this study as well? This was a retrospective cohort evaluation of over 10 years of trauma data from more than 30 trauma centers in a single U.S. state. They compared data from almost 70,000 adult patients who were transported from scene to the hospital. 88% of them were transported by EMS, 12% by a private vehicle, and about 0.4% by police. If you're paying very close attention, you'll notice that that's over 100%, but I tend to round these numbers a little bit. And what they found? Well, what they found was that if you were coming by private vehicle, then you did a little bit better. You had a mortality benefit, which is very interesting to see still. But there were several key differences in the populations that were transported by the different methods. If you came by private vehicle, you were more likely to be younger, a median age of 40 compared to 50. You were more likely to be male, and you were 3 times more likely to have a penetrating trauma, 30% versus 10%, as well as lower mean injury scores. And, this makes me wonder in a lot of ways, right? Because there's a lot of things that go into the decision to transport these patients, at least from a private vehicle perspective. I'm not too surprised that patients are more likely to be transported by private vehicle with a penetrating trauma. Most of the time, these look less impressive than a blunt traumatic injury, where you can look much more kind of messed up. If you got shot or stabbed, a lot of the time, it can be bleeding quite a bit, but it doesn't look that impressive. It's just a tiny little hole. Often you can look pretty good. And I think if the patient is just on the edge of death, most people aren't going to throw that person in the back of their car. So there's definitely going to be a lot of bias built in here. And it's dangerous to make the kind of recommendation that whoever's the first bystander should just take people to the hospital. Private transport, it comes with, possible risks. When you put someone in a situation that they're not qualified for, a lot of weird things can happen. They won't be giving, crystalloids or something like that we don't like to give to trauma patients, of course. But these are completely untrained people, and they could do many other dumb things. Traffic accidents would be probably at the top of my list because you're not going to be driving super calmly and carefully if you have someone dying in your back seat. Ambulances have the benefit of being large, yellow, and have flashing lights and, loud sirens. Most other people, obviously, are not going to have that. So while these results are very interesting, I do not think that we're seeing the whole picture. I can think of ways that you might be able to test this. You could probably randomize 911 operators to make the recommendation that you should wait for an ambulance versus just take that person, to the nearest hospital in your own car. That would be an interesting study to see, but I'm not sure that there's going to be a real impetus to make that happen. Who's going to pay for the new upholstery in your car, too? Blood doesn't always come out so easy. So in a spoonful, there is an association, but it's not necessarily causal between private vehicle transport and lower trauma mortality. All right, let's do a wrap up of everything we talked about today. From the second article, how often is chest pain actually scary? About 5% of the time, but mostly it's ACS, and then everything else shares that last 1%. From the third article, another study showing private vehicle transport to hospital is potentially saving lives, but there's a lot of confounding built in there. Okay, if you're hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were the articles that you missed about? Well, one was about the general approach to the tox patient, at least in the UK. The next was pooling together all the adverse events that we say due to ketamine sedations in children and seeing how dangerous it is. And then finally, What if we broke up the PCAR and C-spine rule into different age groups? Would that perform better? Links to all the original articles can be found at journalfeed.org or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal here at the Journal Feed is for you to keep up the easy way, through spoon feeding. Thank you.